Wait! He didn't do it!
Today's the day he falls. They're calling him the ghost of Crownford. He thought he was untouchable.
Crownford High Court had never felt so heavy. By 8 in the morning, every wooden bench inside the courtroom was filled. Journalists lined the walls, cameras resting on their shoulders like loaded weapons. City officials sat in the front row, faces serious and tight. Ordinary citizens crowded the back, whispering to one another. They were not there for justice alone. They were there for a fall. They wanted to see the untouchable man finally brought down. Outside the courthouse, news vans blocked the street. Reporters spoke into microphones with dramatic voices. On every screen in Crownford City, the same name flashed again and again. Junicio Kong. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and tension. The ceiling lights glowed harsh and bright, making everything look sharp and unforgiving. At the defense table sat Junicio Kong, as still as stone. He wore a white dress shirt, simple and clean, the top button left open. Dark ink curled up from beneath the fabric, tattoos climbing the sides of his neck like quiet flames. The lines were sharp and deliberate, marking him as someone who had lived through storms and survived them. His hands rested calmly on the mahogany table, fingers relaxed. He did not fidget. He did not shift. He looked empty. Not broken. Not afraid. Empty. To many in the room, that emptiness was proof of guilt. A man innocent of such crimes would shout. He would argue. He would beg to be heard. But Junicio Kong had done none of that during the long weeks of trial. He had sat exactly as he did now, silent and composed. Across from him, District Attorney Calvin Reese adjusted his silk tie and rose to his feet. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed victory was already his. "Your Honor," he began, his voice echoing through the chamber, "this case has shown us the true face of power without conscience." He paced slowly in front of the jury box, speaking clearly so every camera could catch his words. Junicio Kong, head of Kong Maritime Group, presented himself as a respectable businessman, a philanthropist, a visionary. He turned sharply toward the defense table. But beneath that polished surface was a criminal network tied directly to the theft of millions from the Riverside Renewal Initiative. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Reese continued, painting a careful picture. He spoke of shell companies and hidden transfers. Of digital trails that led back to Kong Maritime shipments. Of money meant for struggling families that had vanished into offshore accounts. He called it conspiracy. He called it grand larceny. He called it greed. And through it all, Reese said, raising his voice slightly, the defendant has chosen silence. No alibi. No explanation. No remorse. Every word landed like a hammer. Junicio did not move. His eyes remained fixed on a small scratch in the table's polished surface. He could hear the ticking of the clock mounted high on the back wall. Each second sounded louder than the last. Tick, tick, tick. Beside him, his defense attorney, Miles Hart, shifted in frustration. The lines around his mouth were tight, his suit slightly wrinkled from restless movement. Throughout the trial he had argued what he could. He had objected when possible. But there were moments, key moments, when Junicio had quietly stopped him. No alibi. No witnesses. No cross-examination of certain men who had pointed fingers. Miles had begged him in private meetings. 20 years he had warned. Maybe more. Still, Junicio had remained firm. Now, as the prosecution finished its closing statement, Miles leaned closer and whispered under his breath, "This is the last chance." Junicio did not turn his head. He gave the smallest shake of no. Miles closed his eyes for a brief second before straightening in his chair. Judge Roland Mercer adjusted his glasses and looked down from the high bench. His silver hair caught the light as he studied the man below him. "Mr. Kong," the judge said in a steady voice, "does the defense have any final evidence or witnesses to present before this court proceeds to sentencing?" The entire room held its breath. Miles rose slowly. He glanced at his client one last time. Junicio's face was calm. Miles swallowed. "No, Your Honor. The defense rests." The words seemed to drain the air from the courtroom. A few reporters shifted forward eagerly. Pens hovered above notebooks. Cameras angled slightly closer. Judge Mercer gave a slow nod. "Very well." He reached for the sentencing papers placed neatly before him. The rustle of the documents sounded loud in the silence. "For the crimes of conspiracy and grand larceny," he began, voice firm and formal, "this court finds the evidence presented by the state to be substantial." Two uniformed officers stepped closer to the defense table before the sentence was even complete. It was practiced movement. Efficient. Controlled. The metal of the handcuffs gleamed under the courtroom lights. Junio finally rose from his chair when one officer placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. He did not resist. The cold metal circled his wrists, tightening until it pressed into his skin. The faint clink of chain against chain echoed through the chamber. A sound final and sharp. He kept his head slightly lowered. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the prosecutor. He did not look at the cameras. If there was fear inside him, it did not show. If there was regret, it did not reach his face. Judge Mercer lifted the wooden gavel from its stand. The polished surface caught the overhead light, shining for a brief moment. "Mr. Kong," the judge said, voice heavy with final authority, "this court hereby sentences you to—" The guards tightened their grip and began guiding Junicio toward the narrow side door that led away from the courtroom. The gavel hovered in the air. And Junicio Kong did not look up. The gavel hung in the air. The guards had already begun guiding Junicio Kong toward the narrow side door. The chain between his cuffs clinked softly as his steps moved in controlled obedience. The courtroom felt sealed like a box closing shut. Then a voice cut through it. "Wait." It was not loud in size.
Wait!
It was loud in impact.
He didn't do it!
Boots scraped against polished floor as the two officers froze mid-step. One of them nearly lost balance, his heel skidding slightly. Judge Roland Mercer's hand stalled, the wooden gavel trembling just inches above the block. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the sound. In the third row, standing on top of the wooden bench, was a small girl. Lila Whitman. 7 years old. Her fingers were raised high in the air, trembling slightly. Her dark hair had slipped loose around her face. Her chest rose and fell quickly, but her eyes were steady. The room stared. The judge blinked once, confused. "What is the meaning of this?" Lila swallowed and spoke again, clearer this time. "He didn't do it." A sharp murmur moved through the gallery. Cameras shifted direction in a wave, lenses now aimed at the child instead of the man in chains. District Attorney Calvin Reese reacted first. He stepped forward quickly, his expression tightening. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he said sharply. "This is a court of law. The child must be removed immediately." He gestured toward the back. "Deputy." Judge Mercer lifted one hand without looking away from Lila. "Stop." The command carried weight. The room quieted again. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying her. "Young lady," he said carefully, "step down from the bench." Lila climbed down slowly but did not retreat. Instead, she walked forward until she reached the railing that separated the gallery from the courtroom floor. Her small sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished surface. "I have to say something," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "He was with us." The guards loosened their grip just slightly, confused. At the defense table, Junicio Kong lifted his head for the first time since the hearing began. His dark eyes moved toward the voice. And something changed. There was no fear for himself in his expression. Only alarm. A sharp, silent warning in his gaze. Not her. Judge Mercer studied the scene carefully. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lila Whitman." "And how old are you, Lila?" 7. The judge nodded slowly. "Why do you believe the defendant did not commit these crimes?" Lila pointed toward Junicio. "Because he was with us that night." The words landed like a dropped glass. Reese let out a short breath of frustration. "Your Honor, this is emotional interference. A child cannot provide reliable testimony in." "Counselor," the judge interrupted firmly, "you will remain silent while I determine whether this statement is relevant." Reese pressed his lips together, visibly irritated. Judge Mercer looked back at Lila. "Tell the court what you remember." Lila gripped the railing with both hands. "It was raining," she began. "A lot. The streetlights near our building were flickering. Mom had to take me to Northgate 24-hour pharmacy because I was sick." The courtroom remained silent. "I had a fever," she continued. "Mom was inside getting my medicine. He was outside." She turned and looked directly at Junicio. "He stood in the rain. For a long time. He didn't come in." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Lila shook her head slightly as if remembering it clearly. "He stayed there for hours. Watching the street." Judge Mercer frowned thoughtfully. "How do you know it was the same night the state is referring to?" "Because I remember the thunder," Lila said quickly. "And the pharmacy clock said 6:40-something. And I dropped my bracelet when I came out." She reached into the pocket of her coat. From it, she pulled a small, frayed friendship bracelet made of faded thread. "He picked it up," she said. "But he dropped it again when Mom came outside." I kept it. She held it up for everyone to see. The thin strands hung loosely from her fingers. He doesn't talk much, she added softly. But protectors don't brag. A silence deeper than before settled over the room. Junisio's jaw tightened. His shoulders remained straight, but his eyes did not leave the child. District Attorney Reese stepped forward again. Your Honor, this is a manipulation of sympathy. The timeline presented by the state is supported by evidence. And that timeline places Mr. Kong at Blackwater Docks at approximately 6:45 p.m., Judge Mercer said slowly. Yes, Reese replied. The judge's eyes shifted back to Lila. What time were you at the pharmacy? Lila hesitated. 6:42. That's what the receipt said. The word receipt seemed to hang in the air. From the third row, a woman stood. Avery Whitman. Her face was pale but steady. She held something in her hand, fingers gripping it tightly. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. I have that receipt. Every camera pivoted toward her. She stepped forward carefully, holding out the small piece of paper. The thermal ink was slightly faded but still readable. It's from Northgate 24 Hours Pharmacy, Avery continued. Time and date stamped. Deputy Morrow moved toward her at the judge's nod. The courtroom watched as Avery placed the receipt into the deputy's waiting hand. The thin paper changed custody. Deputy Morrow turned and began walking it toward the bench. Deputy Morrow placed the thin pharmacy receipt into Judge Roland Mercer's hand. The paper looked small, ordinary, slightly faded at the edges. But as the judge adjusted his glasses and lowered his eyes to read, the weight inside the courtroom shifted. The sound of chains against Junicio Kang's wrist seemed louder now. The guards had not released him, but they were no longer pulling him toward the side door. They stood still, uncertain. Judge Mercer read silently for several long seconds. Then he read again. The room was no longer breathing. Northgate 24 Hours Pharmacy, he said at last, his voice measured and controlled. October 14th, 6:42 p.m. A low ripple moved through the gallery. The judge lifted his eyes slowly toward the prosecution table. Counselor, he said calmly, the state's timeline places the defendant at Blackwater Docks at approximately 6:45 p.m., does it not? District Attorney Calvin Reese straightened his jacket. Yes, Your Honor. That is correct. And Blackwater Docks, the judge continued, is located across the city from Northgate Pharmacy. There was a pause. Yes. Miles' heart rose immediately. Your Honor, he said, his voice firm for the first time that day, the distance between Northgate and Blackwater is no less than 20 minutes by car under optimal traffic conditions. He stepped forward slightly, placing his hand lightly on the defense table. It is physically impossible for Mr. Kong to be standing outside a pharmacy at 6:42 p.m. and simultaneously orchestrating a transaction at Blackwater Docks at 6:45 p.m. The words hung in the air like a crack spreading across glass. Reese moved quickly to respond. Your Honor, a single receipt does not dismantle the totality of the evidence presented. The state has witness testimony and digital records placing the defendant at 6:45 p.m., Miles cut in smoothly, which would require him to travel several miles in under 3 minutes. A few quiet laughs escaped from the back row before being quickly silenced. Judge Mercer tapped the edge of the receipt lightly against the bench. This court is not interested in emotional performances, he said sternly. We are interested in facts. He turned again toward the prosecution. Can the state account for this timestamp? Reese hesitated just for a fraction of a second. It was small but noticeable. The state believes, he began carefully, that the defendant has the resources to manipulate circumstances. A murmur rose instantly. Judge Mercer's expression hardened. Belief is not evidence, Mr. Reese. The murmur grew louder now. Journalists leaned toward one another, whispering urgently. Pens scratched across notepads. Camera lenses zoomed in tighter on the bench. The energy in the room had shifted. Moments ago it had felt like an execution. Now it felt like an investigation. Junzio Kong stood quietly between the two officers. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes were no longer fixed on the floor. They rested calmly ahead. He said nothing. Miles' heart continued, sensing the opening. Your Honor, this court must consider reasonable doubt. If the defendant's presence at Northgate Pharmacy at 6:42 p.m. is verified, then the prosecution's timeline collapses. Reese shook his head. The receipt alone does not prove the defendant himself was there. Lila Whitman's earlier words seemed to echo in the silence. Judge Mercer raised a hand again, cutting off the argument before it escalated. "This court will not proceed to sentencing under uncertainty," he said firmly. He placed the receipt flat on the bench. "The timeline discrepancy must be reviewed immediately." The room stilled. "I am ordering a recess," Judge Mercer declared. "Proceedings are suspended pending verification of this evidence." The gavel struck. This time it was not a sentence. It was a pause. The guards slowly loosened their grip on Junisio's arms. The tension in their posture softened slightly. They did not remove the cuffs, but they no longer dragged him forward. Around the courtroom, the sound of shifting bodies filled the air. Officials who had moments earlier looked satisfied now exchanged uneasy glances. The confidence that had settled over certain faces began to drain away. Reese gathered his files quickly, his jaw tight. Miles' heart exhaled slowly, relief mixing with disbelief. Outside the courtroom, news broke in waves. Within minutes, updates spread across Crownford City. The sentencing had stalled. A timeline conflict had emerged. Within the hour, court clerks were pulling digital logs. Surveillance cameras near Northgate Pharmacy were requested. Traffic timestamps were reviewed. The official story was no longer stable. Inside the building, whispers replaced celebration. In private corners of the gallery, a few men who had watched with quiet satisfaction earlier now stood rigid and silent. Their expressions had changed. The false victory they had tasted only minutes before was dissolving. No one spoke openly. But the retreat was visible. Judge Mercer returned after a short interval with a composed but serious expression. Pending full review of the submitted evidence, he announced, "The sentencing of Mr. Kong is hereby stayed." The word stayed carried weight. Further proceedings will resume only after verification of the timeline presented. A collective intake of breath filled the chamber. The guards finally removed the tension from their hold. The chain between the cuffs no longer pulled tight. Junicio remained still. He had not spoken a word. Deputy Morrow approached and gestured toward the side corridor. "Mr. Kong," he said quietly. This time the movement was different. Not dragged. Escorted. The heavy courtroom doors opened to a hallway buzzing with reporters. Flashes erupted instantly as the news spread that sentencing had been paused. Junicio walked forward with steady steps, shoulders straight, expression unreadable. The officers flanked him, guiding him past the shouting voices and raised microphones. He did not answer questions. He did not acknowledge the chaos. He moved down the corridor away from the press swarm. For the moment, Junicio Kong was no longer a condemned man. He was walking out as a free man. Long before the courtroom filled with cameras and accusations, Avery Whitman lived a quiet life built on routine and endurance. Every morning, she woke before sunrise in her small apartment at Maple Row, Unit 3B. The space was simple but neat. The scent of detergent lingered in the curtains. The kitchen table was always wiped clean. Lila's school bag rested near the door, packed the night before. Avery worked 2 jobs because she had to. By day, she was a legal assistant at Hale and Borough Legal Chambers. She answered phones, filed motions, and organized documents that belonged to other people's battles. She listened more than she spoke. She kept her head down and did her work well. In the evenings, she walked 3 blocks to Crownford Public Archive, where she sorted old records and returned misplaced files to their shelves. The building smelled of paper and dust. It was quiet, almost peaceful. It was the only place where her thoughts slowed enough for her to breathe. She raised Lila alone. There were no luxuries in their life, but there was order. Breakfast at the same time. Homework at the same table. Lights out by 9. Avery built their days carefully, as if stability could be stacked like bricks against the outside world. But 10 years earlier that world had shifted. Back then, Avery had been a junior clerk working on the Riverside Renewal Initiative. The project was announced as a lifeline for struggling neighborhoods in Crownford City. It promised housing, repairs, and opportunity. Her job had been simple. File the paperwork, organize the ledgers, move documents from one desk to another. At first, she did not question anything. Then she began noticing patterns. Numbers that did not add up. Transfers that moved through shell companies and disappeared offshore. Names of respected officials appearing on documents that did not make sense. She told herself it was not her place to judge. But the unease grew heavier each week. One afternoon, she approached her supervisor quietly and mentioned the inconsistencies. The reaction was immediate. Not anger. Silence. Within days, the files she had flagged were gone. The digital entries she remembered were missing. Her access privileges were revoked without explanation. A week later, she was called into a small office and told her position was being eliminated. There were no details. No argument. Just a polite dismissal. After that, the feeling began. A car parked too long on her street. Headlights lingering in her rearview mirror. A presence she could not prove but could not ignore. She was pregnant at the time. The apartment felt smaller each night. The hallway outside her door seemed longer, darker. Then one evening there was a knock. Not gentle. Not patient. When she opened the door, 3 men stood in the narrow hallway. Their expressions were hard, their posture aggressive. They claimed her late father had owed money. They spoke calmly but their tone carried threat. Avery tried to close the door. One of them pushed it open with his boot. The hallway felt suffocating. They stepped closer. One man blocked the stairwell. Another leaned against the wall. Their words grew sharper, suggesting consequences if the debt was not paid. Avery's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. And then the air changed. A shadow moved at the end of the corridor. From the dim stairwell, a man stepped forward. He wore a simple black jacket. His posture was straight but unhurried. The overhead light caught the side of his neck, revealing dark ink curling above his collar. Even then, the tattoos were visible. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply stood there. The 3 men looked at him. The bravado drained from their faces almost instantly. One of them swallowed hard. Another shifted his weight backward. They did not argue. They did not fight. They left. Quickly. The hallway fell silent again. The man in the black jacket did not look at Avery. He did not step closer. He waited until the corridor was empty, then gave a small nod toward her door. And he walked away. She never saw his face clearly that night. But she remembered the stillness. The control. The way the situation had ended without a single word spoken. After that evening, the feeling of being watched did not disappear. It changed. The parked cars remained sometimes. But they no longer felt hostile. When shadows moved near her building, they felt like distance rather than danger. Over the years, Avery convinced herself she had imagined the hallway encounter. Stress could create strange memories. Until the trial. When she first saw Junicio Kong seated at the defense table, something inside her tightened. It was not his name. Not the headlines. It was the way he held himself. The same straight spine. The same silence that filled space without effort. The same ink climbing his neck like dark vines. During the trial, as accusations tied him to the corruption surrounding Riverside Renewal, the memory sharpened. The project she once touched. The name she once glimpsed. The money that vanished. Was the same web. The same project. The same powerful men. The realization came slowly, like light breaking through thick clouds. The corruption case that now threatened to bury Junicio Kong was the very initiative that had cost her job and placed a target on her back years ago. Every time she had felt watched in the past decade. Every time danger seemed to retreat without explanation. Every time fear stopped short of becoming harm. It had not been luck. It had been him. The silent man in the hallway. The figure under the streetlight. The shadow that stood between her and something worse. Avery sat alone that night in her apartment, the courtroom footage replaying in her mind. Her hands trembled slightly. The web was not new. It had been there for 10 years. And the man on trial was not the architect of that web. He had been standing inside it, protecting her from its edges. The truth settled heavily in her chest. The trial was not about a stranger. It was about the same shadow that had followed her for a decade. And Junicio Kong was that shadow. High above Crownford City, inside the Halcyon Tower penthouse, silence lived like a permanent guest. The walls were glass. The floors were steel and polished stone. From the windows, the city looked small and distant, like something that could be folded into a pocket and forgotten. Traffic lights blinked far below. Sirens rose and faded like distant echoes. Junio Kong stood near the window most nights with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the city he rarely touched directly. His life was built on precision. Meetings were short. Words were few. Trust was thinner than paper. The penthouse felt less like a home and more like a watchtower. There were no family photographs on the walls. No laughter. No warmth. Only order. But once a week he stepped out of that height and into something smaller. He left the building without an escort and walked 3 quiet blocks to Ren and Ink Bookshop. The bookstore was narrow and slightly crooked, its wooden sign faded by time. Inside, the air smelled of old pages and dust. The shelves leaned slightly as if they had been standing for too many years. The floorboards creaked with every step. It reminded him of his mother, Minhee. She had loved books more than anything else. She used to say that inside a book, a person could live many lives without losing their own. She believed words could soften even the hardest heart. Junicio did not read often now, but he liked the quiet. He liked the feeling of being surrounded by stories that were not his own. 3 months before the trial began, he stood in the children's section one late afternoon. He had not planned to stop there. He simply found himself in the narrow aisle where brightly colored covers lined the shelves. A sudden thud broke the stillness. A stack of children's books slipped from a shelf and landed near his polished shoes. Pages fanned open across the floor. Junicio looked down. Without hesitation he bent his tall frame and knelt. His movements were steady and careful. His large hands gathered the books gently, stacking them by size. The dark ink that covered his fingers and wrists stood out sharply against the bright illustrations of dragons and castles. He did not notice her at first, but she noticed him. Lila Whitman stood at the end of the aisle, watching with open curiosity. Her hair was tied into 2 loose pigtails. Her eyes were bright and bold in a way that did not match her small frame. She did not look frightened. She stepped closer. Junio finished stacking the books and held out the last one to her. It was a story about a lonely dragon who guarded a mountain. Before taking it, Lila studied him carefully. Her gaze moved from his face to the tattoos curling up his neck. She reached out slowly and touched the edge of the ink on his hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Junicio paused. For a moment, the noise of the city faded completely. The bookstore seemed smaller, quieter. He looked down at the place her finger rested. "No," he said softly. "Not anymore." Lila nodded as if that answer made sense to her. "You look scary," she continued honestly. "Like the giant in my storybooks." There was no insult in her tone. Only observation. She tilted her head slightly and looked up into his eyes. "But your eyes don't." Junicio said nothing. "They look like they're waiting for someone," she added. The words landed unexpectedly. He straightened slowly, the book still in his hand. His expression did not change, but something inside him shifted. At the far end of the aisle, a woman moved between shelves. Avery Whitman was browsing quietly, unaware of the moment happening only a few steps away. Junio turned slightly, intending to leave before he was noticed. But Lila's voice stopped him again. "You're the man in the black car," she said. He froze. "The one who parks down the street sometimes." Her tone was calm. Not accusing. Not afraid. "You make the bad men go away." The air between them tightened. Junicio had been careful for years. Always distant. Always blending into shadows. Never close enough to be recognized. Yet this child had seen him. He did not ask how she knew. He did not deny it. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. From the end of the aisle, Avery called out gently, "Lila?" Lila glanced back toward her mother. When she turned again, Junicio had already stepped away. He moved silently between the shelves, disappearing into the narrow pathways of books. The creaking floorboards did not betray him. Within seconds he was gone. Lila stood still, holding the dragon book against her chest. She did not run after him. She did not shout. She simply watched the space where he had been. A secret had settled into her small hands. She understood more than most children would. She knew he did not want to be seen. She knew her mother did not know everything. So she kept quiet. Weeks passed. The black car continued to appear occasionally at a distance. The shadow never stepped too close. The protection remained invisible. Lila never mentioned the bookstore meeting. Not at home. Not at school. Not even when the news began filling the television with Junicio Kang's name. She remembered his eyes. She remembered the rain. She remembered the dragon book. And she kept the truth folded carefully inside her like a pressed flower between pages. Until the day the courtroom grew silent and the gavel rose in the air. But in that quiet bookstore, 3 months before everything changed, Junicio Kang vanished between shelves of paper and ink. And Lila Whitman was left standing there, holding the truth in her hands. The storm began quietly. As the National Oversight Review approached, old files were reopened across Crownford City. The Riverside Renewal Initiative, once praised as progress, returned to headlines with new questions attached to it. Missing funds. Incomplete housing projects. Names that carried weight in City Hall. Behind closed doors, a group known only in whispers as the Granite Circle felt pressure tightening around them. They had believed the past was buried. They had believed the paper trails were erased. They were wrong. When investigators began circling again, panic replaced confidence. They needed a shield. A distraction. A face large enough to absorb public outrage. At the same time, Avery Whitman's life began to narrow. It started with a call from her bank. Transactions flagged. Temporary freezes placed on her account. She was told it was routine review. Nothing to worry about. Then her landlord informed her that Maple Row Apartments would not renew her lease due to renovations. No further explanation was given. At Hale and Borough legal chambers, her workload doubled without reason. Subtle comments suggested she might want to keep her past quiet if she valued stability. The pressure did not shout. It pressed. Outside St. Bridget's Primary, the black sedans changed. They were no longer distant. They idled too close to the entrance. Windows remained tinted. Engines ran longer than necessary. Men leaned casually against doors, pretending to check their phones while their eyes followed children across the pavement. Avery felt it immediately. The shift. The warning. One evening, as she walked home through Hollowpine Alley after her shift at Crownford Public Archive, the streetlights flickered above her. One by one they went dark. Her footsteps slowed. The alley felt narrower than usual. The air colder. A second set of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned. Grant Vale stepped from the shadow between two dumpsters. His suit was sharp. His expression colder than the air around them. He held a thin folder in his hand. "You've been quiet for years, Miss Whitman," he said calmly. "We appreciate silence." Avery's throat tightened. Grant opened the folder slightly, revealing papers inside. "You wouldn't want your daughter caught in misunderstandings," he continued softly. "Children deserve safe futures." The implication hung between them. Avery's fingers curled around the strap of her bag. "I don't have anything," she said. Grant tilted his head. "We believe you do." The hum of an engine interrupted him. Headlights cut through the darkness at the mouth of the alley. A black vehicle rolled forward slowly, deliberate and controlled. It did not rush. It did not honk. It simply stopped. The tinted windows reflected the dim alley light. The shape of the car was unmistakable in Crownford City. Recognizable. Powerful. Grant's calm expression flickered. He did not need to see who sat behind the wheel. He knew. The engine idled steadily. No one stepped out. No threats were spoken. Grant closed the folder carefully and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark. The black vehicle remained for a moment longer before reversing slowly out of the alley. Avery stood frozen. The protection had been clear. Too clear. And that was the problem. Across the city, word spread quickly through private channels. The Granite Circle had suspected a connection before. Now they had proof. Junicio Kong was protecting Avery Whitman. That meant she mattered. Which meant she could be used. Within days, shipments linked to Kong Maritime Group were inspected under sudden suspicion. Crates were opened. Documents were discovered. Digital transfers appeared in records that traced stolen Riverside renewal funds directly through his companies. News channels moved fast. Evidence seemed overwhelming. The narrative wrote itself. Behind the scenes, a message reached Junicio. Produce the original Riverside renewal documents Avery was rumored to possess. Or accept responsibility. Junicio read the message in silence. He knew the truth. There were no documents. Avery had been fired before she could copy anything. The Granite Circle did not believe that. In their minds, no one risked protection without leverage. If he denied it publicly, they would tear through Avery's life searching for proof. They would dig into her accounts, her home, her daughter's school. They would not stop. The choice was simple. Expose her, or become the villain. Junicio made the decision in a single heartbeat. He would step forward. He would allow the investigation to center on him. He would accept arrest without resistance. He would let the city believe he was the architect of corruption. Better a public monster than a private target. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning. Cameras crowded outside the Halcyon Tower. Officers escorted him in handcuffs through flashing lights. Headlines exploded across screens before noon. Corporate titan tied to housing scandal. Shipping mogul arrested. Public opinion turned quickly. People cheered online. Commentators praised accountability. The Granite Circle relaxed in quiet satisfaction. Their shield had been raised. Inside Maple Row Apartments, Avery sat at her kitchen table watching the footage replay again and again. Beside her, Lila remained silent. Avery's hands trembled as she began pulling old notebooks from a storage box. Dates, memories, small details she had written down years ago when she first felt watched. She spread everything across the table. The night in Hollowpine Alley. The rainy evening at Northgate Pharmacy. The days black cars appeared near St. Bridget's Primary. She marked the dates of the alleged financial transfers shown on the news. Her breath slowed as realization formed. Every major accusation placed Junicio somewhere else. somewhere near her, protecting her. Her stomach tightened. If he had told the truth, if he had admitted where he had been on those nights, the charges would crumble. But that truth would lead directly to her. The pattern became clear. She stared at the papers scattered across the table. She was his alibi. And he had chosen silence to keep her invisible. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and noise rushed forward like a storm. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Microphones stretched into the air, hungry for a statement, a reaction, a crack in composure. Outside Crownford High Court, the crowd pressed against metal barricades, waiting to see whether the fallen titan would speak. But inside the courthouse hallway, just beyond the noise, there was a narrow pocket of quiet. Junicio Kong stepped into it. Two officers walked beside him, not gripping him now, only guiding him through the corridor. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up slightly, revealing the dark ink along his forearms. The tattoos that once made him look untouchable now seemed simply like marks on skin. His shoulders were straight, but there was weight in his posture. He did not look victorious. He looked tired. Exhaustion settled beneath his eyes, not from fear, but from carrying something alone for too long. The officers paused near the side exit, allowing him space before the press swarm outside. For a brief moment he stood still. Then he saw them. Avery Whitman stood near the corner of the hallway, away from cameras and noise. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Beside her stood Lila, small and steady. Junicio did not hesitate. He walked directly toward them. He did not stop for reporters calling his name. He did not acknowledge the flashing lights bouncing off the marble walls. He gave no statement. He gave no performance. He stopped in front of Avery. For a second neither of them spoke. 10 years of silence stood between them. Avery's voice broke it. Why? The word was soft but firm. Why didn't you tell me? Junicio held her gaze. There was no arrogance in his eyes now. No distance. If you knew, he said quietly, you would have tried to help. Avery swallowed. Of course I would have. And if you tried to help, he continued, they would have seen you. The hallway felt smaller. They already did, she whispered. He shook his head slightly. Not like that. He paused before speaking again. I would rather be hated, he said calmly, than see you buried. The words were not dramatic. They were simple. Direct. Avery's eyes filled, but she did not look away. You let the whole city believe you were a criminal, she said. He did not deny it. I can survive that, he answered. The truth of it was plain. Lila stepped forward before the silence could grow heavier. She wrapped her small arms around his waist without asking permission. Junicio froze. For a moment, his hands hovered in the air, unsure of where to land. He had faced threats without blinking. He had walked into arrest without flinching. But this was different. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to one knee. His arms came around Lila gently, as if afraid she might disappear if he held too tightly. His large hands rested lightly against her back. The hallway around them blurred. In that moment, the man the city called a monster did not exist. There was only a man who had stood in rain, who had watched from shadows, who had chosen silence over safety. Lila leaned back slightly and looked at him. You don't have to hide anymore, she said softly. He did not answer. But something in his expression softened in a way the courtroom had never seen. Avery watched them and something changed inside her as well. The distance that had once protected her now felt unnecessary. This isn't over, she said quietly. He stood again, meeting her eyes. No, he agreed. It isn't. There was no fairy tale between them. No grand confession. What stood there was something steadier. Built from fear and endurance. From shared danger. From long nights and unspoken understanding. It was not a romance of soft music and easy promises. It was the kind born in trenches. They think it's finished, Avery said. Junicio's jaw tightened slightly. They're celebrating. He nodded once. They won't for long. His voice carried no anger. Only certainty. There is a ledger, he continued, keeping his tone low. Names, transfers, governors, COs. Everything tied to Riverside renewal. Avery's breath caught. It's safe, he added. And when the time is right, it will surface. She searched his face. You're going after them. Yes. Not recklessly. Not loudly. But thoroughly. The hallway noise began to grow louder again as reporters realized he was about to exit. Cameras repositioned near the courthouse doors. Junio looked at Avery and Lila once more. We move carefully, he said. Avery nodded. Together, she replied. There was no need for further words. The three of them walked toward the exit. The courthouse doors opened wide, and evening sunlight spilled across the marble floor. The light was warm, almost blinding after the cold brightness of the courtroom. Reporters shouted again. "Mr. Kong, do you have a statement? Are you innocent? Is this political?" He did not turn toward them. He did not look at the courthouse. He looked only at the woman and the child walking beside him. As they stepped into the evening sun together, Junzhou Kong did not glance back at the building that had nearly sealed his fate. He kept his eyes forward. On them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more interesting stories.